Hello and welcome to English Literature with Susan. Today I want to talk about Robert Frost's famous poem Stopping by Woods on a Snowy Evening. Of course, before going to the text of the poem, I just make some explanations about Robert Frost's stance among modernist poets. Robert Frost is a poet that everyone knows. He's famous from childhood. Many children read his poetry at school. So it seems that Robert Frost is a poet available to everyone. But this is not just the case about Robert Frost. Robert Frost has a position and has a stance among literary elites as well. So Robert Frost as a poet stands on both sides. He is comprehensible to the ordinary people. He has something to say to a child, to someone who doesn't know anything in specific about literature. So that someone who doesn't have any specialty in literature can read and enjoy and, of course, understand Robert Frost. On the other hand, the literatis and people whose specialty is literature has also something to comprehend from Robert Frost as well. So maybe the two types of understandings, the ordinary one and the literary one, are different from Robert Frost, and that's why I just like to make an overview. Robert Frost has famously and somehow, with a lot of self confidence, explained that I alone of English writers, not even American writers, English speaking writers in general, have consciously set myself to make music out of what I may call the sound of sense. The relationship of sound and sense has famously, for the first time, set by Alexander Pope in English literature. He says that sound has to be an echo of the sense. But here, Robert Frost is making another claim. His claim is somehow different. Alexander Pope is in search of a kind of balance in poetry, that whatever you say should at the same time be musical and meaningful. But Robert Frost is saying something else. He says that poetry should represent your emotions. So by way of poetry, by way of the metrics, by way of the musical elements, like the prosodic element of a poem, you make something sensible. You show something of your senses, your feelings and emotions. And this is where we encounter a problem in understanding Robert Frost's poetry. Actually, our problem, our issue with Robert Frost is an issue of tone. So, unlike some other modernist poets, his contemporaries are T.S. Eliot, Ezra Pound, Emil Lowell, and many other trending poets at the two first decades of 20th century. But what makes Robert Frost different from them is his understanding of the structure of a poem and his remaining loyal to the traditional form of English poetry. So Robert Frost's issue is not with the metrics. For example, with Ezra Pound, we have the issue of the metrics. With T.S. Eliot, we have it. But for Robert Frost, the pattern is a familiar pattern. He writes poetry in a patterns familiar to English speaking people. So what makes his poetry complicated or somehow sophisticated is the matter of tone. When we read his poems at first, we think that, okay, it's a sonnet and we understand it. For example, if he chose sonnet as his medium. But it seems that there is always a doubtfulness when we read him, when we try to comprehend or interpret his poetry. That's the issue of Frost. That at the same time, simultaneously, we can say what he means, and at the same time, we cannot be sure of whether we're right or not. So this is how Robert Frost stands out in comparison with his modernist peers. But another issue besides the issue of tone and metrics in Robert Frost is the movement in his poetry, the activity in his poetry as it is represented. His poetry, unlike many other modernist poets, Imagist poetry, for example, is not a poetry. Imagist poetry. When we say Imagist poetry, the name is telling. It's about an image. Robert Frost poetry is is about an image in action. So his poetry is not a poetry of pondering and rumination. He he shows actions in his poetry. When we read his poems, check out the number of the tools, check out the number of the movements explain or terms, words related to movement. So Robert Frost, unlike the images poetry that provided, and images poetry was actually his contemporary, but they provide the images poets provided a kind of framework out of an image, that it was like that the movement was in there and they just took a screenshot. But for Robert Frost, it's always an animation in an animated version of life. This is, once again, how Robert Frost stands out. So not only in terms of his tone and metrics, but also in terms of his poetry of action and movement, or the poetry in which we see tools and a task being done. He seems to be different. So his subject matter is somehow different from the subject matter chosen by his other American peers or other modernist poets living, and either Europe or United States. So, though Robert Frost seems to be an easy poet to read, when we check out these facts, when we just compare him with other poets, we see that his poetry has its own frame, its own pattern, its own character and complexities. Now, knowing these things, let us go to the text of the poem. Stopping by woods on a snowy evening. Whose woods these are, I think I know. His house is in the village, though. He will not see me stopping here to watch his woods fill up with the snow. So the image is in the air. And unlike other poems written by Frost, and I just talked about them, this at this point of the poem, the speaker, most probably the poet himself, is just standing. He's motionless, but this doesn't, remain the case. So the words are rather simple. So the lines of this poem doesn't need any kind of explanations. But as you check, you can see the metrics whose words those are. I think I know. So that he plays with the consonants, with the vowels. He is aware of the sound of the words as well. The watch has woods fill up with the snow, so we know that it's snowing. And let us move. My little horse must think it queer to stop without a farmhouse near, between the woods and frozen lake. The darkest evening of the year is like the end of December, the end of the year, the New Year's Eve, and they are not on a shelter. And there is a contrast between the human being in this poem and the horse as an element of nature. The relationship of the horse and nature is rather different from the relationship of this person, the guy who's the speaker of the poem, and nature. The horse needs the farmhouse, needs a shelter, so the beauty of the snow is meaningless to that horse. It seems queer to this animal, but the human being is comprehending something different. But the horse is more natural. The horse it must think it queer. The horse has a thinking as an element of nature. It has a thinking pattern of itself, and it seems weird to him. He gives his harness bells a shake to ask if there is some mistake. And you see, this is the horse as his let's say let's say as the thing which vacillates him, that he can move via the horse. So the horse as his element of motion and animation is giving him an alarm, a warning. What are you doing here, human? He gives his harness bells a shake to ask if there is some mistake. The only other sounds the sweep of easy wind and down a flake. And see how beautifully Robert Frost here just once again makes the sound of the sense of snow, and also the sound of snow itself. The only other sounds the sweep of either wind and downy flake. So that they, but by using actually the sound of where in wind and downy, he gives the kind of movement to, and also a sweep, of course, a kind of movement to the snowflakes. The woods are lovely, dark and deep, but I have promises to keep, and miles to go before I sleep, and miles to go before I sleep. You see, the two last lines are repeated twice because of its prominence. The point of emphasis is here. And the woods are lovely, dark and deep, but I have promises to keep. That as a human being, I cannot just here stand here to ponder. I have to move. So Robert Frost is back to Robert Frost, to movement. And let me add something here. We can have a psychological or psychoanalytic reading of this part of the poem. Wood or jungles, forests, such spaces of wilderness in Freudian psychoanalysis are the representatives of id, or that pleasure principle. And here we see that, and of course, promise shows that kind of super ego, the kind of rational principle we have. So here we see that the promises to go, or the social principle we have, and social responsibilities we have represented by superego. Here, superego is forcing the person out of the id, out of the pleasure principle, and he has to come back to life. Or we can just compare the city life, or the life of the human beings, the civilization and the natural life. All of them in contrast, and human beings are forced to just leave nature. So we can have eco-critical readings of this poem as well, how the human being has to just put nature behind and look at his responsibilities. This was my explanation, analysis, and of course reading of this poem. Thank you for listening, and I hope I can see you in my next videos.